Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Officio Assassinorum miniseries. We have now covered all of the main temples, but there are still some smaller ones left to cover, so I figured we'd go over all of them in one last video. So today we're going to be talking about Venenum, Varnus, Maerorus, and Secretum. Bear in mind that for some of these temples, very little fluff exists, so there will be the occasional leap of logic here, and on that point, let us start with one of the more unique ones, the Maerorus Temple, which basically exists purely as the plot point of a book. But it is such a wonderfully 40k-ish idea that it simply had to be included. What do you do if an Eversword assassin, already the human equivalent of a tactical nuclear device, simply isn't destructive enough? Well, first and foremost, I would highly suggest finding a good psychiatrist and at least consider throwing yourself off a very tall building, but if neither of these options seem appealing, then you create the Maerorus Temple. An Officio Assassinorum organization so specialized in wholesale destruction that even attempting to pronounce the name is actually hurting my tongue just a little bit. It was also a very new temple, created in the 40th millennium as a de facto experiment. It presumably began when an Officio Assassinorum operative, whom we shall refer to as KKND2 for reference purposes, was wandering around the blasted and blood-scorched remains of a hive city ravaged by demonic hordes. When he thought to himself, we can do better. And so he set off on a quest to do just that. A quest that would include considerable amounts of illegal genetical experiments, heretical technology, and quite a bit more than a pinch of absolute madness. The abominable result of this thoroughly ill-thought-out process was a creature called Legienstrasse, the sole result of the Maerorus Temple's experiments. Or at least so the Officio Assassinorum has ever so honestly assured us. But even assuming they did just create one for a bit of a field test, how by the God Emperor's balloon-sized testicles this thing passed even the most superficial and arbitrary set of testing parameters, I will never understand. Because they certainly didn't test its combat abilities, or its survivability, or its reproductive system, or its intellect, or anything else. I am assuming they just basically checked if it could eat bananas and then checked off every other box on the list because, well, if everything else went wrong, at least it could make a decent living as a banana farmer near the edges of the galaxy. And with the creature's future so thoroughly secured, checking anything else would be boorish at best. But, I hear you say, it can't be that bad. You're overstating things. The Officio already produces psychotic, mass-murdering, skull-faced fuckers en masse, and frequently deploys them with a studied degree of disregard for innocent civilian life and property to the point that it makes Disney's treatment of the Star Wars franchise look loving and caring. It can't possibly get any worse. But see, my young and naive listener, as any grumpy old cynic like me knows, it can always get worse. And in this particular case, worse refers to the fact that the Officio's newest experiment was the ungodly hate-raped child of a tyrannid Akrut, and literally the unluckiest human in the galaxy. But let us not dwell too long on the mind-breakingly terrible question of who impregnated who in that particular equation, and instead move swiftly along to the fact that this creature, this crime against the universal laws of decency called Legienstrasse, could near instantaneously vorify any creature it touched. And then, as if it was merely dotting the I's, the creature can turn the biomass it absorbs into any mutation, which it can switch between effortlessly when and where it sees fit. Increased strength, speed, agility, extra arms, bioweapons, bone blades, flesh-eating larvae fired from butthole-like cannons. Anything and everything. And perhaps most disturbingly of all, the abomination then decided it would be a good idea to improve its reproductive capabilities, because of course it did. Allowing it to lay vast clutches of eggs that would spawn into fully fledged murder machines capable of reducing entire companies of soldiers into so much fine minced pizza topping. Oh yes, the Officio Assassinorum had most definitively dropped the ball on this particular experiment. And when they decided to deploy it, regardless of the clear and present danger, not just to the Imperium, but to quite literally everything in the galaxy, as the Officio Assassinorum had somehow managed to out-tyrannid the Tyrannids, the creature decided that it didn't want to listen to orders. Shock and surprise. And went rogue. This is the danger with having an Imperium where nobody's allowed to read books anymore, because, they can't see obvious plot points like that coming. But, to the Officio's credit, they realized that they had done a whoops, and in this particular instance, the whoops would cost the lives of millions, if not billions. And so, understanding that the only correct thing to do would be to come forward, to come clean and inform the governing bodies of the Imperium that there was a genocidal monstrosity on the loose that threatened the very existence of human life in the galaxy, so that everyone could come together and... sorry, I can't finish that sentence. Of course not, they tried to cover it up with exterminators and wanton murder because it's the Officio fucking Assassinorum. What did you expect? And when they finally managed to corner their little accident on a planet, they decided to engineer an invasion by world eaters and demons in the hope that this would force the monstrosity out into the open, where they could presumably kill it or feed it more bananas, for all I bloody know at this point. This brilliant plan ended up backfiring when Legion Strasser somehow took control over both the demonic invaders and the World Eaters. Yes, this thing was so utterly ungodly terrifying that when the World Eaters and demonic hordes of Khorne laid eyes upon it, in collective, near-perfect unison, they all spun around, bent over, and presented their butthole for submissive fucking. I don't think I've been painting a vivid enough picture of how fucking terrifying this thing must have been. It would eventually take a full reinforcement fleet of Imperial Guard, a couple companies of Imperial Fists, including Lysander himself, and 2 Officio Assassinorum Grand Masters to put this most disgusting of Officio Assassinorum science experiments in the ground. Thoroughly. As no one was walking away from that corpse until he'd had been completely and utterly pulverized. And I don't blame them one tiny bit. In the end, the experiments were stopped, and the Maya Aurorus Temple was disbanded, with all of its infrastructure being removed and its experimental logs, hopefully, burned very, very zealously. For whilst on the one hand the experiment had succeeded beyond the wildest dream of its creators, it had, after all, created death and destruction on a scale practically unparalleled in Imperial history, especially for a single operative. But, on the other hand, the unwillingness of said operative to obey even the most basic instructions proved worrying. And so, hopefully, that was the last we ever heard of this particular abomination. Although with the Officio, well, who knows? There might be an operative or two out there who thinks that next time we'll get it right. And now that we've looked at something completely and utterly devoid of any form of subtlety, let us move on to a temple that is all about subtlety. Temple Venenum, master poisoners and artificers of toxicity. As the name already quite clearly suggests, they specialize in killing using a mind-numbingly wide variety of toxins. Already on our modern-day Earth, there are thousands upon thousands of plants with toxic properties, and thousands more poisonous critters wandering, slithering, and jumping across the planet. Imagine then the sheer, astonishing variety in poisons that might exist in the entire galaxy. It should therefore come as no surprise that the agents of Venenum always have a poison that will do just what they need it to. Sometimes you want to make a little bit of a statement, perhaps some frothing out the mouth followed by a brief but fairly painful death. Sometimes you want something subtle. Weeks after the operative has left the planet, the target simply keels over from a heart attack. Occasionally, maybe you want something a bit more drastic. The target sips on his favorite cup of chamomile tea and then explodes in a welter of gore and strangely greenish-looking innards. An operative of Venenum even thought that he had discovered a poison powerful enough to kill a Primarch, when the Officio was tasked by Malcador the Sigillite to take care of the Horus problem. Although in that case it wasn't so much a poison as it was a living creature, a special little worm that sucked all of the moisture out of a body very, very, very swiftly. A bit of a monstrous thing with a connection to the warp, apparently. Now, to be fair, it was supposed to be drunk via a cup of wine, so I guess it kind of qualifies as a poison, at least in some basic regard. But clearly, the operatives of Venenum are not above using animals for their executions as well. Snakes, perhaps, gently introduced to a target's bed, or angry birds with viciously poisoned claws. Who knows? There are many, many ways in which to introduce something fascinating to a target's system. But, as mentioned, the primary benefit of an assassination via poison is the ability to tailor-make the poison to the target in question. Say, for example, that you have an extraordinarily high-value target, with poison tasters, with a vast array of mechanical and technological solutions to sniff out practically any sort of poison. This is one paranoid motherfucker. Okay, well, introducing it through his food or his drink is probably not going to happen. What, then, about an airborne poison? Perhaps our target has a nice little botanical garden atop his private, high-spired abode. Well, a little balloon, a little bit of a remote control, allowing a sprinkling of the poisonous substance to be released at just the correct time, and voila, target down. It may potentially result in the death of a few hundred innocent civilians as well, but, well, sometimes you just gotta do what you gotta do. And don't get me wrong, usually Venenum will be far more precise than that. This was a bit more of an extreme example of how you could potentially take out a target via airborne toxins. Now, of course, Venenum is not just a means of subtle assassination. They would probably prefer it. The ideal kill for most Venenum operatives will be one in which they themselves are long gone, and the timed cocktail kicks in weeks or at the very least hours afterwards. But, if required to do so, the agents of venom can be quite destructive. Imagine, for example, the effect upon a major hive city if the primary water source was enhanced. Perhaps with a drug that doesn't necessarily kill you, at least not to begin with, but sends you into a mindless, frenzied, bloodthirsty rage. Yeah. Infect 1 million or 2 in the cramped confines of a hive structure with that, and you're going to be looking at a rather severe drop in population. But what if you don't want something quite so bloody? Let us say, for example, that a planet has grown too vast. It has outstripped its ability to feed its populace, and the nearby resources of agri-worlds are acquired elsewhere. Well, what to do? Widespread starvation is always an unfortunate thing to have. It tends to depress nearby systems and populations. They might erroneously think that the Imperium don't care about them. They might even get it into their heads that their only chance of survival is rebellion, ludicrous as that obviously is. In these cases, perhaps it would benefit the planet and the Imperium in the long run if there was a sudden yet oddly controlled outbreak of some form of, I don't know, plague, for example. Yes, that might solve the food problems rather quickly. And hey, it was an entirely natural outbreak of disease. No one can be blamed for this, or, well, there is that one political figure. He did complain loudly about the Imperium not doing enough to alleviate the crises. Perhaps it turns out that he was in control of the water reservoirs who spread this plague, or that he was in control of the shipping lanes that brought the rats in. Yes. The world is full of strange coincidences, but on occasion they can be quite beneficial. We've also touched a little bit upon their training here, because, well, I didn't do that with the last one, because, well, there wasn't really a whole lot of training beyond, going wild and eating everything. But for the Venenum, it is the exact opposite. It's not necessarily an overly physical job, though a degree of skills in infiltration is usually quite important. But what it absolutely does require is a good mind. A near encyclopedic knowledge of all of the various poisons and toxins out there in the galaxy is a very useful tool for a Venenum assassin, knowing precisely what to use in which circumstances. And some operatives even go so far as to experiment with their own creative solutions. Whilst the various Venenum temples operate vast underground botanical gardens and holding pens for various vicious animals, certain operatives take it one step further, cultivating their own little gardens or zoological experiments to find ever more potent forms of poison. This understanding of various plants and their properties, and how to utilize them, how to grow them, how to introduce them, and how to tweak a wide variety of chemical compounds requires a great deal of studying. Becoming a Venenum operative takes many years, but on the bright side it is relatively safe as far as Officio Assassinorum training goes. There are, obviously, the occasional accidents with the release of, for example, a brand of poison that chews its way through air filters and so on, but some spillage will always occur when you're trying to train assassin operatives. And speaking of lengthy training processes, the next temple, Varnus, probably has some of the more extreme ones. They are unparalleled masters of information and disinformation. They are trained to seek out any and all forms of data and statistics, to the point where they see it as a kind of addiction. Indeed, some operatives have even been neurologically programmed in kind of the same way that Eversword assassins are to feel pleasure when they receive the correct kind of input. But whereas an Eversword assassin feels it when he cracks somebody's skull open and sups the subtle little brain matter from their cracked craniums, for the Varus Temple it is information. Every time they gather any sort of data, they will receive a little bit of pleasurable feedback. And every time they find something particularly interesting or useful, they will receive a euphoric rush, encouraging them to dig ever deeper into the well of information that they have found. This particular set of talents is of course useful to the Imperium in a wide variety of ways. First and foremost, the simple gathering of data is valuable in and of itself, especially when it is also being continuously analyzed by a mind specifically trained and honed to cipher the most minute of useful information from a seemingly endless stream of garbage. Once a Varus operative is fully installed, usually on a spaceship in orbit wherever possible, or if absolutely necessary should a hardline connection be required, on the planet, perhaps even within the target's palace or other abodes, then the operative begins gathering literally all the data that the area produces. Everything from surveillance footage to temperature readings to cogitator input and output. Literally everything. This of course amounts to an absolutely astronomical amount of information. Terabytes upon terabytes upon terabytes upon terabytes of raw and 99.9% useless data. What makes the Varus Temple so expert at what they do is their ability to siphon through all of that garbage to find the gems hidden inside of it, and then build an ever better picture of the target and its habits. For example, an operative may discover that the target has an artificial leg. Not by observing the target, it has gotten so used to using the artificial limb that it is not visible to the naked eye, but by watching instead the carpets upon which the target walks. Over the course of weeks or months, the length of the carpet's fibers, its wear and tear, is observed minutely by the operative as a part of the massive data stream, and eventually it becomes clear that the right-hand side is slightly more worn down than the left-hand side, suggesting that the target is favoring walking on his right leg just a little bit more than statistically normal for a human being. Of course, this information could be completely and utterly worthless in and of itself, or it could be absolutely decisive. Perhaps this target has a background in the military, which is deciphered by literally hacking into his records and discovering that yes, he was indeed part of a military formation. He lost his leg fighting, and he replaced it and still remained in active duty. In fact, the replacement he chose was an advanced prosthetic capable of concealing a weapon. Suddenly, this information becomes a lot more valuable. Now the question is, can it be discerned whether or not this is the same bionic replacement? And so on and so on and so on. And this is of course just one of the observations continuously being made by the operative, until he has uncovered every last secret, every last habit, every last trick that the target could possibly pull. And then the fun begins. Assuming the operative is here to outright kill the target, then it depends upon the manner in which the target should shuffle off this mortal coil. Perhaps it should be an accident. Perhaps the massive grand chandelier in the ballroom is getting on in years, and the chain that's holding it up is starting to rust a little bit. Maybe the application of a minute quantity of acid over the course of a few weeks will coincide precisely with the target holding a grand ball, and where he will be holding a speech placed right beneath the chandelier. Maybe. Or perhaps it should be something a little bit more, official. Something that sends just a little bit of a message, and the correct message. Say, for example, that when the target sits down and hardwires himself into his cogitator station to download a report from the more seditious elements amongst his friend circle, the thing mysteriously overloads and fries him. Or perhaps simply makes him a vegetable for life. No one would know what he was accessing, except for his closest co-conspirators. That too could be quite convenient. And it is in the orchestrating of these seemingly random, accidental coincidences that Varnum truly shines. They can arrange a death to be as messy as you like, as official as you like, as unofficial as you like. It could mean nothing, it could mean everything. A target could be crushed to death under the immeasurable weight of a massive fallen stone aquila that just happened to fall off a parapet far above whilst the target was at a military inspection, in case his followers really needs the metaphor spoon-fed to them. Or the target could die in a traffic accident. The oncoming semi-trailer simply didn't see the light, or he could swear that it turned green just as he was really hitting the gas. Coincidence and all that happen all the time after all, and I'm sure no one would even think to look twice into such a natural-seeming accident. And of course, as mentioned, information in and of itself is valuable. And therefore, a Vanus operative is not just good for assassinations. A rebellious populace may be placated with news that says that the Imperium is heading their way with relief, or overwhelming military might. On another occasion, perhaps the ruling elite of the planet have decided that the Imperium just isn't doing enough to sew pillows under their overly fat arms, and they are considering seceding from the Imperium. Perhaps the populace is not quite as happy with this idea, however, and perhaps the nobles' plans will end up spread to every single corner of the planet, specifically to those people with an interest in armed defense of the Imperium. Naturally, this can also be used against forces that are already actively hostile. Information can be gathered upon the expected invasion routes of Chaos raiding parties, or the location of high-value targets can be discerned through interrogation and study. The location of a particularly vile sorcerer, for example, that can then be graced with the presence of an Eversor assassin. But this is of course all dancing around the important subject of how is this information gathered and processed? Well, part of it is training. Through a combination of hypnotic indoctrination and mental shaping, the Vanus operative is able to compartmentalize his mind and run several different analyses all at once, turning his brain into a hyper-advanced cogitator. This alongside literal biological shaping of the operative's mind, and of course technological aids like enhanced data ports and the ability to hardwire into virtually any technological communication or data gathering equipment, turns the operative into a literal human computer. The technological tools also, of course, don't just allow him to siphon through the data and store it and utilize it whenever he wishes, but it also allows him to access the data in the first place. A Vanus operative is able to crack virtually any form of electronic security if just given a little bit of time, and once he is in, there is pretty much nothing he cannot access. Even closed-loop systems are not safe from a Vanus operative, as the temple utilizes quite the variety of tiny little machines to access these difficult-to-reach systems. They could take the form of tiny little flies to infiltrate through ventilation grates, or the form of little worms to slither down grates and access hardwired cables. Occasionally, this can be done with a great deal of secrecy. Just a handful of tiny little metal insects are unlikely to arouse much in the way of suspicion, assuming they don't get smacked, and then people might wonder why there is so much metal inside of the flies. Alternatively, in cases where subtleties are not necessarily required, in, for example, enemy territory, vast quantities of these infiltrators could be dumped directly on top of the enemy's infrastructure. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of them will undoubtedly be discovered and destroyed by enemy countermeasures, but as long as a few dozen make it through and manage to establish contact with the Varnus operative, then everything's good. But there is of course a problem. The Varnus operatives are excellent at gathering and analyzing data, absolutely, and data can be as effective a tool as any, but the Varnus Temple does not tend to train its operatives much in actual combat. They may carry a basic sidearm, a pistol of some sort, a knife maybe, and they can on occasion use their cybernetic familiars and tools as weapons of a sort, improvised perhaps, or maybe even specialized, small digi-weapons worked into rings or pieces of clothing so as to be concealed to ambush an enemy. A Varnus operative is hardly defenseless, but when compared to the other assassins, he practically is. This is one of, if not indeed the reason, why Varnus operatives prefer to carry out their work at a very safe distance. Orbital distance, if at all possible. A Varnus operative in a small cloaked stealth pod, for example, can be able to operate a wide variety of mechanical aids down on a planet's surface, and only the most advanced scanning and detection technology will be able to locate him. But this does require a wireless connection to his various cybernetic familiars and the enemy's data, of course. Those things can be easier to block and interfere. Heavy interference can make it very difficult to extract any clean data, and whilst Varnus operatives undoubtedly could deal with a fair degree of corruption, some data will simply be too badly damaged, making it far more difficult to carry out the operative's goals. Depending on the kind of time frame he's looking at, it may on occasion be necessary to directly infiltrate the target's strong points. In the case of hardened military targets in particular, it is unlikely that the operative will be able to gain significant access via remote means. This, by the way, is why I personally think that the Varnus operative is probably the most valuable part of the Officio Assassinorum's execution forces. Indeed, I think if they simply paired up several of the assassins, the Venenum certainly, the Vindicar absolutely, the Calidus no doubt, with a Varnus operative as well, that would make their lives a hell of a lot easier. But assassins are solitary creatures, so I guess that is reason enough. Plus, well, there is a bit of a backside as well. It may make life easier for the other assassin, sure, but he's also going to be getting all of his data, and by extension his temple's data, stolen by the Varnus. And, well, whether or not any temple of the Officio completely trusts the other, maybe during the glory days of the Officio, perhaps, but these days there is far too much competition and there has been far too much internal strife within the Officio for everybody to trust one another. Especially when it comes to people that are obsessed with data and knows how to utilize it as literal weaponry. And finally, speaking of that, we're going to have a look at another temple, the final temple, Secretum. This one is quite a fascinating one that we know very, 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 very little about. which is perhaps to be expected from an Officio temple basically named Secrets. And they are quite good at their jobs as well. All we really know is that they are kind of the direct opposite of Varnus. They gather information just like the Varnus, but the nature of the information gathered is quite different. They keep the Imperium's deepest, darkest, dirtiest secrets. They ensure that the information is still there, in case a loyal Imperial servant should require it, because, once again, information in and of itself is valuable, and anything that is valuable can be turned into power. But, at the very same time, this information is so incendiary that if the incorrect people were to learn of it, it could have dire consequences for the entire Imperium. As to the precise scale of it all, it is obviously somewhat diffuse, but the location of the Emperor's throne room, for example, could be one of these secrets. If the Imperium's enemies knew precisely where to shoot a nuke at the Imperial Palace, maybe it would do something, maybe it wouldn't. Maybe his throne room is guarded against such things, but why take the risk? Other things that should probably be kept on the down low are things like the existence of the Canis Helix and what it does to the Space Wolves. That's something you don't necessarily want to be everyday knowledge. The Lion's ultimate fate, how he's been sulking on the rock for 10,000 years, that too could perhaps be considered a hint demoralizing. The various atrocities carried out by the Imperium, the execution or deportation of entire planetary populations, occasionally for relatively minor crimes that they really couldn't help. The existence of the Grey Knights, the locations of their base, that's the kind of information that quite a few servants of chaos would pay dearly for. The locations of gene seed storage vaults as well. That too is valuable stuff, not necessarily dark, but absolutely valuable. And who knows, maybe the Imperium knows more about the Dark Angel's internal scuffle than it lets on. Partially because, well, the Dark Angels are still valuable to the Imperium, and revealing to them that they knew their dark secrets, well, I imagine that would piss them off a little bit. And they might do something quite drastic to ensure the complete and utter secrecy of that particular piece of information. Indeed, quite a few dangerous little pieces of information come to mind, don't they? Well, the Imperium has been around for well over 10,000 years. It's not strange that it has gathered up some dirty laundry over that period of time, so perhaps it is nice for it to have an organization like Secretum. Because, again, this information could be valuable to the correct people. And the Imperium has already forgotten so much about technology, about the Emperor, about its past, that I am sure it would not wish to forget any more. Hell, Secretum may even have been created during a period of time when somebody foresaw that very problem, but was more worried about certain particular pieces of information being forgotten, something that could be both harmful in the incorrect hands, but also very dangerous if completely forgotten. The existence of a certain dragon on Mars, for example, leaps to mind right away. You don't want a lot of people to know about that, but you do want a couple to know about it, so that they can throw it a snack on occasion and replenish the Guardian. I also suspect that whilst Secretum's primary objective, of course, is the maintenance and the, well, keeping of secrets, I would also be very surprised if they did not have some way of eliminating those who mayhaps accidentally or mayhaps very, very intentionally discovered one of these secrets. Perhaps Secretum trains its own operatives in these more specialized kinds of assassinations. Perhaps they work together with the other temples, who knows? Or maybe they have some entirely different way of assassinating targets. Perhaps that is one of the dark secrets. For example, just as a bit of a theoretical here, there are certain inquisitors within the Imperium, more radical inquisitors, that have on occasion utilized the powers of chaos and even bound demonic entities. That, of course, would be very much so a big no-no to the vast majority of the Imperium's population and ruling class, and, well, hell, 90% of the Inquisition itself. But if nobody ever knew you did it, trees falling in forests and making noises and so on. Just a theoretical thing to dwell on. Or perhaps I should say a heretical thing to dwell on. Badum-tish. And with that brilliant wordplay, if I may say so myself, I will wrap up the Officio Assassinorum mini-series. Next week, we have a little bit of a special one, I think. A little bit of a remake, perhaps. All you need to know, for now, is that I think it'll be good enough to warrant a premiere. Hopefully, you will all agree. Until then, I've been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.